Hi, everyone. This is Tom McMillan, the CEO of Lead One, and thank you for joining us for this, our latest Lead One virtual forum. This is our 72nd webinar since COVID began, and this is a very important subject, balancing risk and opportunity, what athletics departments need to know about the climate, sports, betting, regulatory climate. We have some very esteemed panelists with us today, but before getting into that, I wanted to have Sarah go over some ground rules and housekeeping.
Thanks for joining us today. Just some quick housekeeping items. Please note that all attendees other than panelists will remain in a listen-only mode for the entire discussion. A few ways that you can speak as an audience member. One, you can use the raise hand function and I will recognize you and unmute you individually. Two, you can message us directly in the questions tab. These questions will be read aloud and you will remain anonymous. Or three, you can write a question in the chat box, but note that anything written here will be seen by the entire audience. With that, Tom, I'll kick it back to you.
Well, thank you. 5 years ago, Nevada was really the only state in the country that offered legal sports betting. And then we have a Supreme Court decision in May of 2018. Now, state after state is moving forward on sports betting. We have 33 plus states, plus the District of Columbia, now engaged in legalized sports betting. 20% of Americans bet on the Super Bowl. In 2022, over $300 million spent on national commercials by sports betting enterprises. And so this is a really important issue for our colleges because the United States is the only country in the world where there is widespread sports betting occurs on college sports events. And so there's a lot of opportunity here, but there's also a lot of risk. And to really unpack this and get into both sides of that equation, we have a tremendous group of panelists. The first is Matthew Holt, who's president and founder of U.S. Integrity. Matthew is not, there he is, he just joined us. So Matthew, thank you for joining us. And Matthew in U.S. Integrity, a partner with the pro leagues and college conferences to ensure sports betting integrity. Dr. Michelle Malkin is a nationally recognized expert on problem betting, problem gambling. And Michelle, thank you for being with us from East Carolina University. Mark Potter is with us. Mark is the head of delivery at Epic Risk Management. They work closely with the NCAA on educational programs and the like to really deal with problem gambling as well. And last but not least, Kevin White, who is executive director of the National Council of Problem Gambling. It's really the oldest organization in the country related to this issue. And again, he works on the issue of gambling and some of the problems that it has caused. Let's get right into it. Let's go down the list. So where is the state of sports betting on college campuses today? You had to kind of crystal ball it right now. Where do you see it's at? Let's start with, let's go down the list. Mark? Or yeah, Mark, go first.
Yeah, look, I think legalized sports wagering has changed. The outlook on it, I think there's more exposure now, there's more marketing, there's more access to it. More people are betting on college sports. So therefore, that brings a lot of increased risks to the athletes themselves, I guess, and the team they represent and the college they represent. So from our education programs that we go to, and we visit 75 schools a year, we're finding that it's a huge risk, both in terms of personal welfare for problematic play due to a number of circumstances and natures that athletes have, competitive nature, buzz replication, injury, etc. But also we cover the sports betting integrity risk because that is obviously going to be on the increase. And then we cover the other knock-on impacts, which are athletes getting abused now online because so many people are starting to bet on these sports. People generally don't like to lose money, and it's very easy for those people, especially those suffering from harm, to project those to project that anger onto the athletes. So I think it's a hugely important time. And I think there's a lot of different topics and ways that things need to be covered and the athletes need to be educated on. But fundamentally, you're talking about very highly skilled, competitive people who find it very easy to also look for similar avenues of replicating that buzz outside of sport. And given the fact that it's so professional now, elite college sport is essentially hugely highly skilled. You're talking about a really vulnerable population who essentially don't get paid but are living and breathing as professional athletes every day. So it's very easy for them to look to gambling to almost pass the time, because you don't get much alcohol, you don't get many drugs. The testing procedures for that are so high that I think it's a really, really dangerous time. And education, prevention, fit for purpose regulation, all of those things and treatment need to be ready to prevent and minimize harm.
Michelle, the view from East Carolina.
So I would echo much of what Mark said. The things that I would add to that is that we honestly don't have a lot of research yet to really have empirical numbers for what's happening on college campuses around sports wagering, especially among our athletes. But with what we do know, we know that athletes are at a high risk of engaging in gambling and potentially being at risk for gambling related harms associated with that. The other thing is that it really depends, honestly, on what state our student athletes are in right now, because depending on what state they're in, it may be legal for individuals to be engaged in sports betting, and or they could be in a state like here in North Carolina where legally it may not be allowed, but people are still engaging in it. So we have a dual market of people who are engaged in legal and regulated sports betting, and then college students who are engaged in unregulated and illegal sports betting. So we have those kinds of things happening depending on where people are at. We also have, depending on what school and what state people are at, a kind of normalizing of engaging in sports betting by things like certain corporate entities actually sponsoring stadiums and things like that, and having advertising and stuff on college campuses where that's at some schools and not others. And so understanding what the effects are of that will be, we're still in the early stages of that to even know what kind of effect that's going to have on our college students. What we do know in terms of student athletes is they're much more likely to engage in risky behavior just for the fact that they are an athlete, and therefore are much more at risk to not only engage in gambling, but also fall into potentially at-risk behaviors associated with it.
Hey, Michelle, quick follow-up. So in states like North Carolina, where it's not legal, the problem's still very severe?
I can't say actual level of severity because we are actually researching this right now. We are engaged in a research study across the entire UNC system right now. So we don't have the outcomes of that yet. We will within a very short period of time. But what we do know is that our athletes are engaging in gambling behavior, even though here in the state of North Carolina it is not legal.
Well, Tom,
More
just
to come on that. So no, I'm going to turn to you now, Keith. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, to present some context on your question, we did a survey in 2018 of 28,000 gamblers across the United States, and we found no statistically significant differences in sports betting participation between states where it was legal and states where it wasn't legal. The illegal market is alive and well, and in fact, I think for a lot of athletes, they prefer the illegal market because there's a higher chance of them getting caught if they use the legal opportunities. But yeah, no, our surveys indicate that roughly 75% of college students report placing a bet in the past year. That's not just on sports. That's buying lottery tickets and going to casinos. I think, and I agree with what all the other panelists have said, what Mark and Michelle have said. The only thing I would add before we flip it over to Matt is that one of the big issues is that a number of states have legalized sports betting at 18 years old. The majority of states, it's 21 because it's seen as a casino game. But in those states, like DC, Kentucky, others, where sports betting is legal at 18, you've layered on additional risk on top of risk on top of risk on top of risk, and we can talk more about that later.
Matthew Holt.
Well, one of the things I think we need to consider, Tom, is, we talk about wagering on collegiate campuses as if it's just part of the sports betting ecosystem or a very small piece of it. But in actuality, the number one and number three most wagered on events in North America, the NCAA men's basketball tournament, as well as the college football playoff, are the number one and number most wagered on events in North America. March Madness as a whole, the 64 games played in that tournament, do 3 to 5 times more handle than the Super Bowl. So we're not talking about minuscule amounts of dollars being sprayed across, collegiate events. They are some of the most popular wagering events in North America. And to Keith's point about the 18, even in states where the age limit is 21, we're preparing these young individuals to participate in sports betting through daily fantasy sports, which is very similar. So here we go. Now at 18, I could play daily fantasy sports games. I could play daily fantasy sports games against the house in parlay fashion. By the time I get to be 21, I've already been doing the same exact activities for 3 years. So I've been trained now to participate in sports betting. And I think one of the most important things, and we're starting to put real numbers to this, is taking the actual real numbers, what's being wagered on college events in each and every state, on each and every team, so that we don't have to guess, we don't have to wonder, so that we can actually quantify and say definitively, here's what's happening across college campuses across America.
Well, let me open this for anybody. So you're an AD, and they say, I get it. This is exploding in America. The pros are doing it. I'm getting all kinds of pressure to do it. It increases my engagement. That recent study that said that 50% of sports bettors will watch a game to the end if they have a bet on it, a blowout, compared to only 20%. And last but not least, hey, I need some money to pay for all this compliance and all this checking up on all this. So what do you say to the AD that throws those kind of arguments at you?
Well, Tom, I'll just jump in first. I prepared a slide deck, but I think we can just do better just conversation wise. Here's the questions that as a lead one AD, I would ask. Do you know how many of your students, and especially student athletes, are gambling, and certainly sports betting? Is gambling included in your campus wellness surveys, your risk prevention and educational programs? 2. 3, does your college have a comprehensive gambling policy for all students and a specific policy for student athletes? 4, does your college have problem gambling prevention, counseling resources available year-round? And then 5, is there a safe harbor in conjunction with mandated reporting for student athletes with gambling problems? I guarantee you that none of the people on this webinar have all 5, they were able to answer all 5 of those questions with a yes. I guarantee you. And that is the minimum. That is the absolute bare bottom minimum. As Matt said, this is one of the largest gambling markets is on college athletics. And we can't get this. Those five questions answered with a yes. At any school,
we'll be sure to send that out to every one of our schools. The 5 must-dos. Anybody else has?
I want to echo something that Keith just said. In the study that we're doing, we asked students if they know if their campus has a gambling policy, and less than 5% even know. But then when we actually looked across the system here and looked at how many campuses do have policies, there are several campuses that have 0 policies around gambling on campus, and then nothing around athletes in particular. And then we also asked students, are you getting any kind of information about gambling and problem gambling in your courses or in any kind of resources on campus? Only 2 students out of everybody so far has said yes. And that's in a course that a faculty member chose to talk about that. We're also asking them if they have been at all ever asked about, any kind of stuff associated with their own problem gambling. They've never been screened for it on their campuses. So we have a whole bunch of resources we need to be putting in place if we're going to have campuses engaged in any kind of gambling. And those resources don't yet exist in most of the states here in the country.
Michelle, I can probably back that up. I think most of the places that we visit have had a policy, but most people don't know it exists. Most colleges also do have really good counseling systems and networks, but don't have problem gambling specific services. They also have every year they have the don't bet on it, what you can and can't bet on education, but not linked to any of the risky behaviors akin to athletes. So I think, look, at the moment, the reality, as we were talking about before, there's 1,200 NCAA colleges. We're getting around to 75 a year, and that is great, and they're getting huge value out of that. But that is going to take some time, and obviously students are coming and going every year. So there really needs to be a whole emphasis placed on this, where yes, we can provide the education, but there's got to be follow-up to that, where there's fit for purpose policies. There's I guess a system within the college that promotes people to be able to come and talk openly about the behaviors, because I think there's probably a reticence for that at the moment, especially from athletes, thinking that it's going to impact the scholarships or the careers if they do openly admit to doing some of this. Let's be honest, there's real grey areas in terms of sports wagering from what you can and can't do. They can't bet on any NCAA sponsored sport, but they can bet on horse racing, they can bet on NASCAR, and they can go to the casino. The problem is, if you log on to a sports book that has horse racing and NASCAR, it also has the things that they can't bet on. So we're finding that, and then obviously the other increased risks and the links between problem gambling and sports betting integrity are obvious, because for me as a former athlete and a former problem gambler, I can almost guarantee I was prepared to commit crimes to try and pay my debts off. If somebody would have approached me to fix an element of a game, I'm almost certain I wouldn't have been able to say no due to the situation I was in. So it's really important to provide an all-encompassing program that educates, has fit-for-purpose treatment, and then also has the monitoring systems like I'm sure Matt is going to tell us about now.
Now, I want to ask Matt that question. How serious is this problem right now?
So when we look at sports betting as a whole, and we send out alerts in a multitude of ways, operators identify suspicious activities, our system identifies suspicious activities. We average 15 to 18 alerts a month, half of which lead to suspensions, bans, and arrests related to nefarious sports betting activity. So that's about 10 suspensions, bans, and arrests related to sports betting a month. That's 120 instances a year where people are arrested, suspended, or banned from their sport related to nefarious sports betting activity. And those are the only ones we caught. And what I always thought was interesting in the collegiate landscape is everybody starting to learning, in an ecosystem where the vast majority of the people in administrative leadership roles have been told their entire careers to stay away from sports betting at all costs. It's the great evil. You're not allowed to touch it. There's an educational element that comes in. Where we've seen great adoption is at the conference level, where they're engaged, they understand some of the risks, they want to do something. I can't tell you how many times at the individual university level we've talked about the importance of them understanding when their athletes are under investigation and there's abnormal activity around their events. And they say, boy, I don't think we want to know this information. If we don't know, then we don't have to react. Those days are gone. The media knows, the betting community knows, regulators have to know, action has to be taken, wagers have to be voided, investigations have to take place. That old school rhetoric of let's bury our head in the sand, and if we're not notified, then we don't have to do anything, I think is just as dangerous as the lack of sort of, policies and procedures, as Keith discussed across the country. It's really important that everybody take this head on to say it's not going away. May 14, 2018, sports and sports betting clashed and mixed together, and they will never be pulled apart again.
Hey, carrying on with that thought, paint the probable scenario down the road and timeframes. I mean, you can all answer that, but tell me how this plays out. I mean, I read the NFL story. It was a one-day story. Ho hum. How does this play out in college sports in your view? And you're in the catbird seat.
Well, so Tom, I'll start by saying
Well, go ahead.
Two of the Detroit players that were suspended were right out of college. So unless they just decided to turn pro, and that's when they started gambling. That's when they started getting those apps. I think that is extremely unlikely. I think they were gambling all through college. We know that in fact, 90% of Division I male student athletes who report betting on sports, 90% of them who report betting on sports place their first sports bet prior to entering college. So this goes a lot deeper. But yeah, I would say how this spins out, I don't think it's a Division I program. I think it's going to be a smaller D2 or D3 program where there's even less compliance. There's even more violation of gambling rules. 25% of college student athletes already tell the NCAA they violated their gambling policy in the past year. And that's 25% who've told the NCAA that. I suspect the number's higher. It's going to happen, I think, in a D2 or D3 school. It might even be women's sports. It's going to be a smaller sport, I think. Because there is Matt will tell you, there are lines on everything now, and there's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot less scrutiny on D2 and D3. You know, maybe women's volleyball. I hear a lot about. You know, table tennis. You know, but it's rugby. You know, Mark's a rugger. You know, I think that's where the risk is going to be. I don't think it's going to be the star programs and the star players. But there's enough money sloshing around, and especially now with in-play betting, you don't have to fix a game. That's passé. You just have to fix a particular play, and you just have to fix a particular play that you are involved in. And it might well be,
I'm sorry, Keith.
missing a shot, hitting a shot, getting a foul on a particular play, something that is utterly undetectable. Matt will see it after it happens, or we might see the chatter beforehand. Anyways, Matt, you can talk about the implications of in-play betting on integrity.
Go ahead,
And
Matt.
one of the big misnomers is that all of these match fixing or game manipulation or misuse of insider information schemes are big multi-million-dollar schemes. And that's the biggest misnomer of all. Oftentimes, these are a couple $1,000s to student athletes who are in an extremely vulnerable position at the time. It's almost never some big multi-million-dollar scheme. It's almost always money that some of us would deem as insignificant: $1,500, $1,200, $1,000, $500 to manipulate certain portions of matches or activity, or to provide certain information that's not available to the public. So I think that's one of the bigger misnomers as well, as we think of these huge multi-million-dollar schemes, and they're not. It's taking advantage of young people, men and women, at a situation where they're more vulnerable than other people would be, and more susceptible to these types of situations. And at the end of the day, I think Keith brought up a really good point, is we see more wagering on non-men's basketball and men's football, which everybody thinks of March Madness and college football as the two big drivers. The women's NCAA tournament final this year did over $100 million wagered on it alone. It was the most money of any college women's basketball game ever. And coincidentally, every year we're seeing more and more dollars wagered on women's softball, because after March Madness ends, coincidingly at the exact same time, NBA regular season ends, NHL regular season ends. There's this huge content void for the sports books that they have to fill. They fill it with college baseball and college softball. And suddenly a sport like softball, where there's like little to no betting, there's huge spikes after March. And to Keith's point, those people are extremely vulnerable.
So
Hey,
I just want to,
before I go to Michelle, I'm
Yeah.
gonna just make one point. If anybody has any questions, make sure you submit them in the chat room so we can open this up. Michelle, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
so I just want to respond to a couple of the comments made, and that is that the one thing I will agree is that it wouldn't be maybe a high profile player, but I do think it's more likely to be a male player than a female player. And I'll tell you why. Research we know about the development of the brain and things like that, maturity levels, not calling male student athletes less mature than female student athletes, but we do know that they may be more vulnerable to the kind of swaying that might occur, the kind of manipulation. And so I do think it's more likely to be a male player than a female player. I do think it's going to be in a sport that many people do bet on, because a high wager in a unknown sport, that's something might be more red flaggy. But the one thing I would say is I don't think it'd be a high profile player. I think it would be somebody who's not looking at getting a professional career out of it, where they might come from either they need the money for one reason or another in their own life or their family's lives, and somebody approaches them, and I think it's right. It's not going to be millions of dollars. It's going to be couple $1,000s that can make a big difference for that particular student or their family. And that's where I think the controversy might come. And so I kind of am leaning towards more of the male sports, but I also don't think it's going to be the highest profile players on those sports.
Michelle,
Mark,
I agree with that. I think I agree with that. I think it's more likely to be a male. I think males in general would be more likely to take risks than females. There are simply more male sports that are being gambled on at the moment, I also suppose. I think the biggest thing for me is to understand why this stuff happens. I would also guess singular sports like tennis, golf are possibly more likely to be infiltrated with integrity issues, because if the only person that you are taking the risk for is yourself, then that makes it easier than potentially impacting your teammates. I think we just need to understand why this happens. Is it a lack of awareness? Is it because athletes are more likely to take risks? Is it because they think they can get away with it because it's been historically done on more black market until they've legalized sports wagering? I think there's a lot of things we need to know and understand, but we're starting to see more of it. We saw Calvin Ridley, obviously, in the NFL. We saw the Lions players last week. There's a Washington Commanders guy. I think we need to understand what it is, and is it a lack of education? Is it the willingness to take risks? We need to understand why before we can fix that problem. But I think, as everybody else said, it's fundamentally for NCAA college athletes, who I would guess are at the most risk, because they're living and breathing like professional athletes without the remuneration or pay for it. So people asking them to provide a little bit of information, and it usually will start at a very low level and then build up more from there. And then once they've got you and you've given them something, it's very easy for them to come back and ask for more and more and more. I think we need to understand what that is and how each college and how the NCAA can protect against these things. Because I worry that it's been happening for a long time on the black market, and now we're going to start to see more evidence of rules being broken because it's easier to monitor, verify, and check names and IPs through legal sports wagering.
Hey, one of the things, I hear all your answers and I'm sitting there saying, wow, I mean, what I'm trying to understand is the consequence. If there is a sports betting scandal, what would it mean to our universities? But I'm getting the sense that you say it may be a couple thousand here, a couple thousand there. And this is not like the organized crime scandals in Europe or in Germany in soccer or in the Far East that are, about exploitation and vulnerability and all that. It sounded like you were minimizing that. And I just want to make it clear, are we talking about real high level crime and real problems for our universities, or are these just going to be one-offs?
So I
let's
don't
look
think
at a public case real quick, just when we talk about repercussions. So UFC, that was a very public case out of there, that match in November. We identified that match. There's an article in every major publication about that match. Multiple jurisdictions, both in Canada and Ontario and Alberta and New Jersey, banned that league for a period of time until they were able to show that they remedied the situations that caused that to be able to happen. The amount of dollars lost in sponsorship and advertising to a league, to a potential conference, to a television network now, if you cannot gamble on that sport, even for a period of time, is unbelievable. I can tell you that the UFC took that very seriously. They took all proper actions they could immediately to remedy that. Right now, gambling means eyeballs on the sport. And the second jurisdictions say, hey, you can't gamble on this sport anymore because of what's happening, that's the repercussion to the league. And I think everyone should look at Alberta and Ontario and New Jersey and the UFC example very recently. We're not talking years ago, 4 months ago in November, of what is likely on the table and what can happen if you don't have the proper safeguards in place.
And Tom, the other thing I would add, and as a former member of Congress, you probably know this better than I, it was Senator Bradley introduced PASPA in response to college gambling scandals on basketball specifically.
Right.
And for most of our nation's history, betting on college sports has been prohibited. It's only been fairly recently that it's been broadly, and I would say to many of the proponents and advocates on the gambling side of things, and to all the athletic directors here, what Congress giveth, Congress can taketh away. And we've only had widespread legal sports betting for the past 5 years. It's not guaranteed to go forever if there are scandals. I think that's the other impact of whether it's a minor or major scandal. And yeah, ASU, Headache Smith was only getting a few thousand per game. And when it was still just a local bookie, but when that information started getting out, when organized crime did get involved, when people started betting millions in Vegas and other places, that's when that whole thing came down. So I think that while the amount of money can be small, the reputational risk is immense, and the sort of legal risk or the political risk, if you will.
That makes,
That social license to operate is sometimes on very shaky ground.
Michelle, you had a comment there.
I think they pretty much covered what I was going to say, but I will just add to that what it can mean for an individual. And I mean, we were talking about college students. So if this happens, you're talking about that individual probably losing their ability to stay in that college, to stay in that sport. So there's the effect on them and the effect that that has on everybody else associated with it. It has the effect on the whole team and everything associated with that college and that university. It can affect the alumni of that university. It has a kind of rippling effect, even if it's what seems like a small amount, which isn't a small amount to that individual when they made that decision to take it. And I do want to keep the idea that it may not just be that individual. It could be that the person who is approached is a family member who then approaches that individual to do that because of the money that it could help towards the family. Because a lot of our college students are supporting their own families back home. And we have to remember that there is that relationship. Something that we haven't talked about that I think is just really important. I really appreciate that Keith brought up kind of, Congress and legislation and looking at this on a federal level, because what I want to say when we're like expanding sports betting so much, and we're expanding it and college sports betting especially, we're not giving forth the kind of federal resources we normally do around kind of addictive related behaviors that could lead to these kinds of things. So we have on all college campuses programs around drugs and alcohol, but we have nothing on gambling. And those programs not only come from those individual states, there's federally mandated work and money behind that and research behind that. And that's what we lack. So we have this like rapid expansion of a new behavior that's we're saying is allowed without any of those federal resources to kind of address all the things we need, the resources, the education, the research, et cetera, to kind of ensure that our college students are safe around it.
And that's a good point. You remember Senator Schumer and Senator Hatch wanted to pass a national bill, couldn't get it through, probably prohibited college, probably prohibited Olympic betting. So that, to Keith, that's one of your points that could be a consequence. Let me go to Mark just for a question, because I often wonder about our regulatory structure, the fact that we have state by state, and in England, you have one jurisdiction regulating everything. Anybody want to talk about how inefficient America's regulatory system is and how that could lead to problems?
Well, not just state by state, Tom. We have to remember the US isn't just 50 states, but when it comes to gaming, it's over 200 tribal jurisdictions as well.
Right.
So the US, when it comes to gaming jurisdictions, is almost 300 individualized negotiated sets of rules. We know that better than anyone. We have to get licensed in each and every one of those jurisdictions and try to identify abnormalities and report into different sets of entities using different sets of rules. I mean, imagine the betting operator. Of course, they're susceptible to mistakes. You have to develop a betting system now that's going to accommodate, the 40 different jurisdictions you're in and their 40 different sets of rules. It's easy for stuff to slip through the cracks in areas where, hey, you're not supposed to offer in-state college betting. But how do you know your system won't? We identify instances all the time where the systems allow wagers through that they shouldn't, because it's too hard to have 40 customized sets of different, systematic policies and procedures. And then on the other side, it's hard for bettors or even the normal person to understand the rules. And think of a state like Washington State, where it's all tribal. So you have over 20 tribes, each and every one of them has their own sets of rules, and the state has their own sets of rules. If you walk up to the average bettor in Seattle, Washington, and say, what are the rules here? They're not going to know all the different nuanced rules in the 20 different jurisdictions.
And then you layer on, so that's just sports betting. You've got daily fantasy, which is even more loosely regulated. You know, Fox Sports is going to say you can sign up for our app at 17 plus, and our age verification is check the box that you are 17. And you're going to get bombarded with information on how to play free prediction games to predict the outcome of a sporting event. I mean, it is, yeah, it would be like having, as Matt said, 300 different sets of regulations around alcohol usage, and then expecting kids to figure it out. Oh, you should have known that you can't drink gin until you're 22 in Virginia, but wine is okay at 19 and a half, unless it's in a to-go container. And it is insanely complicated. And it really makes, that's why it makes compliance only solutions almost impossible. Right now, the vast majority of stuff that is being done at the college level is compliance focused. And I get the enforcement perspective. You have to have enforcement, you gotta have compliance, but you were talking about a addiction issue. You're talking about public health, and there is if there's no consistency in the rules, and your main way of dealing with gambling is just to tell people to follow the rules. And if you can't explain it yourself, how do you expect these kids to comply?
Well, okay, so you're saying sports betting is here to stay, and yet I'm an AD. I got to spend a lot of money to keep my program clean, and the only way I can get that money is go sell some advertising. And a state of Maryland just required disclosure. That is that a good thing or bad thing? Or what do I do as an AD to protect myself without, having to go in my pocket all the time to cover these costs? Any thoughts?
I do think it is interesting. At the end of the day, these things do cost money. None of these programs are free. Addiction treatment, real-time integrity monitoring and identification, education, awareness programs, all of them cost money. To Michelle's point, I think that we took it for granted when sports betting regulations were being rolled out, that there needed to be some sort of subsidization of all of these, programs that we need. And everyone just thought the advertising dollars were going to roll in. But recently we had AGA language come out and guidance, which sort of led to the staying away of sponsorship on collegiate campuses. We've had letters come out from US senators, and of course the data space is very convoluted and difficult to understand and navigate right now. So I do think it's a real challenge for all of the collegiate campuses that they do face sort of a crisis at a time when so many other issues have popped up, like NIL and all these issues on a campus. They all cost money. How do you get the money to put forth toward these programs, which are so important? Everyone on this call, you're talking about some of the most important programs associated right here. I mean, you have Keith and Mark and myself running an integrity program, and all of them are so critical. But I do agree, right now, many of these ADs are faced with the budgetary restraints of, which ones do we take? When do we take them? Which ones are the most important? And that's a shame, because in reality, all of them are so critical right now to the student base.
Matt, I think you're right. I think I've spoke to a couple of colleges that were in a real quandary, especially after COVID, where their athletic budgets had took a battering because they would sell out the basketball stadiums with season tickets, and they had a year or however long it was without that revenue. And then suddenly you saw a Colorado, Maryland, and LSU partnering with operators offering big dollars. And it was like the moral compass of, should we take this money that's on offer that will refill the pot, which is pretty empty at the moment due to the last few years of having to deal with the COVID. So I think that created a quandary. I think back to your point about the UK is probably a few years in advance. And I think we can see that given the fact that now in the UK, they've just taken away the ability for Premier League soccer teams to have front of shirt gambling sponsorship. in the next sort of couple of years. You can't bet with credit cards in the UK. You can't market and advertise and offer ridiculous amounts of free bets that if you go onto a DraftKings or a FanDuel at the moment, it's a deposit $5 or $10 and here's $500 free. Let's be honest, for a young college kid who sees that, who might be trying to pay the way through college, how hard is that to turn down? So I think we've got to find the best way of regulating everything, as well as providing the educational pieces for the athletes to understand what all these risks are, as well as having fit for purpose treatment pathways for those that do suffer from harm. But getting policy and everything right is needed, because in reality, one thing is no use without the other. It's no use us going educating colleges if there's no monitoring of the data, if there's no treatment pathways, if there's no regulation, because people will just keep doing it. And I think it's got to be an all-encompassing approach to tackle not just the integrity bit, but the problem gambling piece, because I'm almost sure they're quite closely interlinked in college sports.
Sarah, you have a question.
Yes. So the first one, what about the potential for a facility to be involved in passing students through in a course so they are eligible to play?
So I can take on that just from a faculty point of view, in the sense that there's a lot of rules and regulations around college student athlete studies, and they have special programs set up to help them with tutoring and things like that to keep them eligible. But there's so many regulations against a faculty member kind of just passing a student for the purpose of getting them eligibility. In fact, from my point of view and from the people I've talked to, they will work with a college athlete to get them to the point where they are passing a course, but they would never do that. Now, if you're starting to include the idea that the individual could be, the faculty member could be betting on their own team's sport, and that player is important, I can see where this could come into an ethical or integrity issue, but then that person could be risking their own career, their own tenure if they have it, et cetera. So there's different kinds of regulations on both sides.
Any other questions, Sarah? We have a lot of questions, but you've answered a lot of them. Go ahead, Sarah.
Another one that came up, is there a difference in risk for athletes in D2 and D3 versus D1, and D1 Power 5 versus the rest of D1?
I think there probably is, given the fact that, as people have talked about, in terms of integrity, I would say so. I would imagine if you've got a high-end Power 5 D1 footballer who's highly likely to be getting a significant NIL deal, you're probably less likely to have somebody like that involved in an integrity issue than you are a D2 or a D3 footballer that is a lot more under the radar and is highly unlikely to be on maybe a full scholarship or playing in a lot of televised games that you can see. So I think the further you go down, the more likely the integrity is. I think every athlete ultimately falls into a risk category of vulnerability to problematic play because of who they are as athletes. As I said, I played professional sport for 13 years. I was also a pretty significant problem gambler. And only through going to get treatment for me was I able to understand that a lot of the reasons why I did what I did was in some way related to who I was and what I was as an athlete. As we talked about competitive drivers, everyone who plays sports at any level is competitive. Winning is great and losing is terrible. Whether you're 5 years old playing soccer in the garden with your brother or sister, you want to win. To get to a level of high-end D1 sport or professional sport, you have to have those competitive drivers in droves. My issue was I was like that all of the time and there was no off button. So when I started to gamble, and more importantly, when I started to lose, I didn't enjoy that. And I didn't like the feeling of being a loser because of those competitive drivers. And then actually, there was never a time where I was able to put my hands up and say, I'm not very good at this. I need to stop. The athlete in you says, I need to carry on doing this and become successful. And that's then slowly but surely starts you on the cycle. And then you deal with things like injuries or transfers and things that fill a void that you ultimately look to fill with something else. And for me, that was gambling. And then you win a lot of money as a young kid, and that increases the adrenaline tenfold. And next minute, you're making all sorts of poor decisions. And it can lead you down the path of then the integrity comes into play, the problem gambling, the loss of career comes into play. And it's a really short career for a college athlete. So that's one of the main things we talk about is, look, this is a really short career. Don't let this be the thing that stops you from fulfilling that potential, because that is a bitter pill to swallow.
How does that?
There is a big difference between, real quick, Tom, between the D2 and the D1. And I'm happy if anyone reaches out, we're happy to provide these numbers. So at the D1 level, baseball, softball, basketball, men's and women's, football, volleyball, all of these sports are available for wagering because the books are happy to offer them. They're on ESPN3 or some streaming network so people can watch them. When you get to the D2 or D3 level, it is mostly men's basketball and football. Most sports books, pull up any of your betting apps right now. There's no D2 softball games available for betting today. There's no D2 men's baseball games. So I will say this, there's a lot of betting on D2. The athletes are probably, yes, certainly more vulnerable, but the mainstream sports are the only ones available in D2 and D3 at most of the sports books. Whereas in D1, just about every sport is available on almost every betting app.
Someone raised their hand in our in our chat room. Do they want to speak and ask a question? Sarah?
Yes, that was Bill Wood.
Phil, do you want to ask a question?
All right.
We have another question in the chat room, right, Sarah?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. My name is Bill Wood. I'm on the University System of Maryland Board of Regents. And the one thing that I am curious about is how can a college or a university measure any gambling problem that might exist on its campus, either with the students or the faculty? How would you determine that?
I can say that there's a lot of research tools out there and a lot of people very interested in conducting this kind of research, especially right now among whether it's an individual institution or across the country or across the state, to see what's happening on the college campuses. We have some numbers that have been done from different studies, but it's really important to include every campus in those studies. And so reaching out to one of the researchers interested in this, NCPG knows a lot of stuff as well. So I'll leave it to Keith to continue that conversation.
Sure, Michelle. No, thank you. But yeah, the same way you would measure other risk-taking behavior. So you can telephone surveys of the entire population, you do in-person stuff, because many people are not going to answer a question about gambling or drug use or things like that, honestly, openly, the first time to a stranger. But just as university administrators have been struggling for decades to get a handle on all the other risk-taking behaviors, so too can you add gambling. And you ask it in the same way. You have to dig, you have to pry. It's doable. We have a pilot project with Towson University right now, through our funding with the NFL, to help develop a prevention curriculum for college student athletes. But it's not if you build it, they will come. It is, you have to build it, and then you have to work with Michelle and Mark and others to get it into them and be there on campus. And this is a hidden addiction, and it's especially for college student athletes, it can impact their eligibility. And so they are so reluctant to talk openly and honestly about gambling. Most of us are reluctant to do it, but especially athletes who have so much to lose. You're going to have to work to get at it. But as Michelle said, the numbers that are there, roughly 75% of college students tell us they've bet at least once in the past year. The participation rate among college student athletes is lower by division. Roughly 65% from the NCAA's own studies of Division III athletes reported betting the past year. Only about 50 to 55% of D1. So there you see, as the divisions, as you move up, people may gamble less and their rates of compliance tend to increase. But no one at the D1 level should feel complacent, because that still means 50% of your college student athletes are betting. 25% report to the NCAA that they violated NCAA gambling laws itself. So the risk increases in the lower divisions, but that doesn't mean that it's nominal in the higher division.
Sarah, thanks, Bill, for your question. Sarah, you have another question, right?
Yes, one more question. What are the top 3 proactive steps athletics programs should take to mitigate potential future risk?
I typed an answer, Sarah, but I can reiterate it. I think it goes towards making sure that there are gambling specific programs for students in general and student athletes in particular. And those gambling specific programs would be on the compliance side, obviously, but on the student counseling and health services side, the research piece that we just talked about with Maryland, you got to know how many of your kids are gambling already. And then making sure, I think the last piece I would say for legal ADs is to make sure that there's a safe harbor. When we talk to college student athletes who have gambling problems, they almost unanimously report they did not come forward because they feared that because the only remedy that they saw in the NCAA rules was punishment and loss of eligibility. So unless you have a policy on campus of encouraging some sort of safe harbor reporting, you are not going to find your student athletes with gambling problems until they have a problem and there's a scandal. Because right now, the way I read, I don't think it's the NCAA's intent, but if you read the regulations, if you admit violating the gambling laws, there's not really a lot of gray area. You lose your eligibility. So that creates an enormous disincentive for the people who need help the most from coming forward before they're caught.
Keith, I think you're right. I think there's always got to be a sanction if there's any obviously issue. But I think what's slowly starting to happen with the NCAA, they're starting to recognise that cases need to be dealt with on an individual basis, and there may be some potential mitigations. Whether that is the losing the full scholarship and eligibility and it gets reduced down to maybe a year, I don't know the answer to that. But I think they are starting to look at ways of at least dealing with things on a case-by-case basis, rather than just saying, if it's X amount of dollars, that's it, end of. I think the answer to the question for me is you've got to have a proper policy on campus, a proper gambling policy that everybody knows about. You've got to have education awareness campaigns such as ours. You've got to have you've got to link in with those around the treatment facilities. You've got to have a problem gambling specific counsellor ready to deal with issues on site. You've got to have the staff who are up to speed with being able to identify early signs of vulnerability, whether that for an athlete is, constantly skipping practice, always being on the mobile phone, getting overly emotional watching sporting events. If you start to recognize signs of that and then have people that can have positive empathetic conversations with those athletes and try and deal with that as it comes, then I think you can probably start to deal with it. But colleges don't have to embrace this as such, but they have to recognize that this is now part of the landscape and it's not going away. So to try and brush it under the carpet and pretend it doesn't happen is a pretty negative way of dealing with it. Being proactive and dealing with all of these and having all of these on campus is really positive.
Hey, and think about college campuses, they're open. I mean, I'm an NFL player. I go back to my house. No one sees me. I'm limping around the campus at Maryland if I have a sprained ankle. And there's a lot of influences because you are in an open environment. Sarah, you have one more question, right?
Yes, one more question. Can you elaborate on the NFL's involvement in mitigating sports wagering concerns in college?
Sure. We received the National Council on Problem Gambling. We received a multi-year, multi-million-dollar grant from the NFL to try and address some of the key areas. And one of the key areas that we told NFL we needed was some evidence-based youth addiction prevention programs. In particular, funding grants for college student and minority college student athlete gambling addiction prevention programs. So we've awarded 23 grants over the past 2 years. We're evaluating those, but we hope by the end of this first 3-year grant cycle to have some proven evidence-based prevention programs, particularly for college students and college student athletes, that then can be used as models, toolkits by any college system. So as I mentioned, Towson University's received one. There's a number of other universities that receive these grants. And so we hope that, so the NFL is trying to help mitigate risk, obviously on the pro side, by making sure that we can evidence-based programs on the college and youth side. And really high school is where it's at. That's where most gambling starts. So so there's a lot of work still to be done, but that's just real quick, the effort.
Hey, shifting gears, all these data deals, official data sales by conferences, whether it's the MAC, you see it in the NFL and the NBA for big bucks. Is there a downside to data sales? Anybody? Matt?
I don't know if there's a downside to data sales. At the end of the day, I do think it's important that any league, professional or collegiate, sort of get some controls in place around their data. Because if you don't have any, then anyone is plugging into your data and using it for any purpose that they want. And some of those purposes you're not going to like. So one of the main, I think, important factors in getting data deals done is getting some control over your data and where it's going. You create that content, that data is yours. There's probably some things you don't want that data or content associated with. So being able to get control of that data is pretty important. And I think it can be a revenue stream. I think people just need to be careful of thinking of data in one specific, oh, I give my data rights to a company, they then turn it into betting data and sell it into sports books. And what we're seeing in the US collegiate space is that doesn't really exist anymore. You can't stop the other people from coming in with their little cell phone looking blocks and pulsing the data. And thus exclusive data rights don't mean a lot in the US without any type of state mandates in place that mandate official data use. So at the end of the day, I think it's important to get control over your data, but then think of your data in different ways. Interactive rights, how do we layer that data? What else can we do with it downstream, media and content wise? And the first step is always actually getting control of what data you have and how you compile it.
Anybody else on that one?
I think as we see in-play betting continue to go, we like to say anything that can be measured and monitored, which is every aspect of an individual performance or performance within the game, will be made into a market, and can be monetized. But you have to be very careful that you don't have your betting partner or your data partner, offering props on, Michelle's bone density is slightly lower, so we think she's got a higher risk of being injured. And so there's a player prop on her, blowing out an ACL this in the next 15 minutes in the next game. And as Matt knows, we're not there yet, but we're not there. So the use is, I think Matt said it great. The uses of data, and especially players' own data, players' own performance data, there's some kind of Orwellian stuff that could be coming down the pipe. In golf, you can already bet on length of shot off the tee, you can bet on the loft, the club head speed. Because if they track it, they can turn it into a market. I don't think they get a lot of bets on it, but it's interesting territory.
In play markets have massively increased the data stuff. Let's be honest, you're tracking run meters, passing yards, minutes played, basketball, whatever it is. There's 20 years ago, you bet win, lose, or draw on games, and now there's 200 markets on any individual sport. So, in any one game at any time. So, data is massively important because ultimately traders want to price up the right stuff that they don't lose money. So, they need the data for that. So, there's obviously going to use that. I think we've also got to worry. For me, on the on-campus stuff, anybody can sit and take stats on campus, watch practice, do what they need. I think it's probably the most vulnerable population where if you've got a professional sportsman, if you go to the Baltimore Ravens training camp tomorrow, there is literally only the staff and the athletes there. If you go, I was just at Boston College this week. those athletes are also in class and around X amount of other normal students every day who can be picking up information, watching somebody walk past in a boot or on crutches and say, right, they're not playing this week, so I'm going to use that information that I've picked up to place bets on that. And then they tell their friends who tell their friends. Next minute, people are placing wagers on something very innocent, just that they've seen around campus. So I think the college sport thing around this is really crucial to get that right and to protect the athletes in many ways, because there's so many risks for them now.
Well, thank you all. We just lost Matt. He had to jump for another call, but I'm going to ask one quick question of all of you. And Matt kind of answered this for me some time ago. What is the probability of a major sports betting scandal on a college campus within the next 3 years? 0 being 0, 100% being absolute.
I would say 100.
100%. So you
I would
say
say 100% in the next 3 years, there will be one of those. If we're seeing it in the NFL, where people are prepared to lose X amount of millions of dollars a year to take a ban for, with Ridley's case, $1,500 parlays, with these other guys, very small outlay. The sheer amount of colleges there are and the sheer opportunities that there are now, I would be almost certain that there will be something, because you can't educate everybody. You can't make everybody do the right things, make everybody make good decisions. We can just try and minimize that as much as we can. And I fear that it will take something like this, a major scandal, for some people and some organizations to really take notice of how serious this is. So my guess would be
100%.
somewhere between 99 and 100%.
Michelle.
Okay, so I'm going to take a slightly different take on this. I think the potential for it is 100%. I think the likelihood that something will happen is 100%, and somebody will be approached is 100%. Because of lack of regulatory oversight, because of people do get away with stuff, I think we may have people getting away with stuff more often than we know about it. So I don't know if we will actually see the controversy, even though it occurs.
Wow.
I do believe within the next 5 years, there will be a public controversy. But will every single time something like this happens, will we know about it? Probably not. And that is the risk, unfortunately, that the individual who takes the money will have.
Keith, you have the last word.
I agree 100% with Michelle. It's already happening. We just don't know it, but it's something in the next 3 years. A scandal will be caught, but it's there now. We're just not seeing it.
Well, I can't thank you all, Michelle and Keith and Mark and Matthew. I can't thank you enough for your insight on this. This has been great. We'll summarize this. We'll get it to all of our schools, and really appreciate you taking the time to do it. So have a great weekend, and we'll continue this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.